Hey everybody, this is Chris with Overclockers Club. We've got a couple of coolers from Be Quiet. So over the years I've reviewed quite a few products from Be Quiet, and the first thing that comes to mind for me is quality. They've got some really nice hardware, and I'm sure we'll see the same thing between these two coolers. So this is the first foray that I've seen of Be Quiet using RGB on their products. Up till now, I have not seen any RGB used. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it'll be interesting to see. We've got the Pure Rock 2FX in black, and we've got the Pure Loop 2FX also in black. This is a 360 millimeter liquid cooler, and this is of course an air cooler. Actually, let me give you a real quick tour of Be Quiet. If you're not familiar with Be Quiet, they have quite an array of products that they've added to over the years. They've got power supplies, cases, water coolers, air coolers, fans, and they've got a nice power supply calculator here. So if you're not sure which power supply is best for your system, you can use this. Click on that and you put all your information in from your system parameters, and it will let you know, or it'll give you a recommendation. So we've got power supplies, cases, coolers. As far as air coolers, we can break that down into three tiers or three levels. You've got the basic, which is the Pure Rock series. Sort of middle ground is the Shadow Rock, and then the high end is the Dark Rock series. And you can look at each one of these and compare the different coolers and get information there to help you make a decision. The liquid coolers here, we really have two. We have the Pure Loop and the Pure Loop 2FX. We have some different varieties in terms of sizes too: 120 millimeter, 240, 280, and 360 on the Pure Loop. The Pure Loop 2FX, which is what we have today, we've got a 240, a 280, and a 360. And we'll actually be sort of testing that out, because over here on my test system, this one here uses a 13900K for the CPU. This is a Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi from MSI. And the other test system I've got is a Z690 Tomahawk with a 12600KF CPU on it. And that CPU will certainly put out a lot less power. So the air cooler would actually be more at home on that CPU, and the liquid cooler here would be more at home on the 13900. However, I will put this on the 13900 just so we can see how it performs. And the advantages and disadvantages to these two styles of coolers, and this has been beaten to death over the years, but basically with an air cooler, you have one moving part. Of course, if you've got two fans, you've got two moving parts, but really the only moving part you have that can fail is the fan. So worst case, if your fan fails, you have a huge heat sink that can basically absorb heat off of your CPU, and you won't get a situation like you can get with a liquid cooler, where if your pump fails, you're not moving liquid through the system anymore, which means your CPU is going to spike on the heat very fast as compared to an air cooler. And of course, being a liquid cooler, you have the potential for a leak. So the failure modes include a seal failure at the pump, a failure at the connections for the fittings at the pump and the radiator or the tank here. You can have the tank itself leak. You can have a leak in one of the tubes in the radiator. So there are many failure modes. However, I will say, in all of the liquid coolers that I've looked at over the years and the ones that I've used, personally, I have not had a single leak from any of the coolers from any of the manufacturers. The only exception to that would be the one that I dropped and actually broke the fitting right there that goes into the pump that you can see, and I made a video on how I actually repaired it. But that's the only one that leaked. I dropped it, it broke, my fault. So again, the failure modes on an air cooler, you've got one, which is the fan. On a liquid cooler, you've got fans that could fail, and you've got leaks, and you've got a possible pump failure. And again, on the fans failing here, it's unlikely that you would have all of your fans fail at the same time. And looking at the back of the box, let me zoom in a little bit here. Okay, so it looks like they're using 4 heat pipes, 6 millimeter diameter copper heat pipes for high cooling capacity. There's 150 watts TDP, asymmetrical construction, does not block any memory slots. So what they're saying is the base is offset a little bit, and we'll see that when we get it open, and that allows for some room for your memory so it doesn't interfere, especially if you have memory with tall heat spreaders. Let's see the fan. You can see it's the RGB effects around the perimeter of the fan. Light Wings 120mm PWM high-speed fan offers impressive illumination for a vibrant, unique look, strong performance, and quiet operation with efficient cooling. And then we've got the same thing stated there in German. Now, as far as the specifications, let me zoom in even further. Okay, so we've got, let's see, weight including the fan. It gives the weight, so 685 grams. The dimensions here, the height is what's usually important because you need to know that if you have a shallow case. So it looks like we've got 155 millimeters on the height, and I'll explain that when we do a system build a little later, the importance. We've got the latest socket coverage here from Intel, the 1700 and the AM4 for AMD. Let's see, there's your decibels for the noise, number of heat pipes, 4 with 6mm diameter. Of course, we already talked about that. We've got, it looks like a single fan on this one. Sometimes they have two fans, a push-pull. 2000 RPMs is the maximum. Current 4-pin PWM. Okay, all right, well, I guess we can go ahead and get this out of the box. And they do a pretty good job in their packaging, I've noticed. In years past, and it doesn't look like they've changed. So there's a nice cardboard spacer. Some foam to keep things from bouncing around. There's the fan, and that's got some weight to it. That's actually pretty solid. So there's the ring around it where your RGB effects will take place. Here's a 4-pin PWM connector for the fan, and then here's your RGB connector. Here is the cooler, and it looks like they put thermal paste on from the factory. So if you're going to do multiple installations, which I will be doing, I'll have to make sure to reapply the thermal paste. Should be the hardware kit. Instructions. They're usually like warranty information in different languages. And that's it for the box. So looking at the cooler, this is all black from top to bottom. So they cap off the termination points of the heat pipes there. And I counted all the fins. Looks like we've got 55 fins. And that does not include the top plate, which I guess is sort of a fin in a way. But you can see how it's offset here. And again, that facilitates your RAM so we don't have any RAM interference. And I'll show that when we do the actual installation. And the base, as you can see, it actually has some fins on it also. So this is like an aluminum extrusion. And they incorporate some fins there to assist with the heat dissipation. So let me put that back in the base for now so we don't damage the thermal paste. Instructions. Oh, that's nice. They have some nice graphics here. And if I recall correctly, Be Quiet always had nice instructions. They were well made, and a lot of thought goes into them. So we've got some fan clips, and they're actually two sets. So if you wanted to add a second fan, they've got you covered there with a second set of fan clips. So that's nice. All right, so we've got the hardware kit. It looks like they've also labeled the bags, which is nice. So we've got an Intel kit and an AMD kit. This looks like a common piece. So this is the bar that goes across the bottom of the cooler to hold it down. Yeah, there's the mounting screws right there. Okay, so set these off to the side. Let's kind of take a little bit of a closer look at the instructions. So it looks like we've got an Intel and an AMD section that highlights the steps necessary. And on the brackets with Intel, you usually have multiple positions based on which socket you're using, and this shows you which position to use in the mounting. And let's see, shows you how to connect your RGB for your fan. There's basically your bill of materials showing the components and the quantities, which is good to check to make sure you're not missing anything. Warranty, 3-year manufacturer guarantee from the original purchaser. So that's not bad. Okay, well, I guess we can start getting this installed on the test system. Okay, we're getting ready to get the cooler installed. This is an MSI Z690 Tomahawk motherboard. This is a DDR4 version, and this is a 12600KF CPU from Intel. Now you have to pay attention to the instructions here, because for this particular installation for Intel, you need to use these little rubber O-rings that get sandwiched between this bracket and the bottom of the motherboard, so you don't want to overlook that or put the O-rings in the wrong place. Now, one thing that's kind of handy, the little bag I opened up that has all of these little tiny components in it. Once you open that bag, you can't really seal it again and the stuff will fall out. So what I do is, you know, those little containers you get from the restaurant, has your ranch dressing in it or whatever. Well, I keep all my stuff in there so it's all in one place. And the reason you put those little O-rings on there is they keep these little studs retained to the bracket. Now I need to use, you can see there are like 2 squares punched out there. For the LGA 1700 bracket, you need to use the furthest one out. And then the little O-ring pushes over that, over the end of the stud. And there's a little shoulder all the way down there that the O-ring seats on. And that keeps your little stud there from falling out when you insert this from the bottom of the motherboard. Now I have a decent sized cutout on the bottom of my base plate here, so I just have to reach under there and push that bracket up. These are the Intel 1700 cross brackets, and then you have to think about, okay, if I want the cooler to sit on there like this. Now the offset here is not going to be nearly as concerning on this particular motherboard, so I can set this either way. But the crossbar goes through this opening right here, so I need to think about how these are oriented. And for this particular installation, they will be like that. And then next, these little spacers go on there for this socket. I've got first 3 on there. This is the last one up here in the corner. Make sure they're all good and snug. And now we're ready for these brackets. These will go on top. And then we'll get the brackets screwed down. Remember, when you're working around your motherboard, always be careful so you don't slip and shove the screwdriver down into your motherboard. That's why I usually try to use 2 hands, one to turn the screwdriver and the other one to guide it and hold it steady. All right. And the last screw. And then we're ready for the cooler. And then there's this special cross member. And it actually has a pocket, you can see right there, on each side, and this raised portion of the bracket fits into that pocket and sort of holds this steady so it can't twist. And to make sure I have enough fan clearance, I think I will put the offset to the left. So the bracket goes in. You'll notice we've got some slots here that fit into the slots here on the bottom of the cooler. So we get these all nice and centered. All right, we've got that placed into position. Now we can get the main screws installed. And I get them both started. You don't want to tighten one side down all the way. I get them started to where they just start to take a little bit of a bite, and then I'll alternate from side to side. A few turns on each side. And then we are fully engaged, and that feels good. All right, now we can get the fan on. And they do have some arrows on the fan frame showing you that the airflow is that direction and the blades spin in that direction. So viewing it, they would be counterclockwise. And then the fan clips, I usually try to put the cables coming out the bottom if I can. So we'll see if I can get both of these started at the same time, or if I have to do one side and then the other. It can be a little tricky. One side, and almost got it. Here we go. All right, so that is on there. Now get the cables moved to the other side and plugged in. And I'll get the graphics card back on there. And I actually had a big 4080 graphics card on there, but it was so big it obscures the cooler. You can't see the cooler. So we're just going to put a 2070 on here. It's much smaller, has a much lower profile. All right, let me get the power on that. All right, we are ready to power it up. Okay, the RGB effects are rolling on the fan. And there we go. All right. So usually the first thing I do after I get a new cooler or anything with a new fan is you do a fan tune. And that's usually within the software that comes with the motherboard. And I'll show you here in just a moment. So what you're doing, let me zoom in a little here, is you're basically calibrating the fan so that the system knows what RPM the fan is running at a given voltage. Well, this is PWM, so it doesn't really change the voltage, it changes the pulse. So you have to come over here to features, you go into user scenario. I usually go over to customize. And down here with the fans, click on the CPU fan, and over here is a fan tune button, and I hit that, and it takes a couple of minutes, but it basically runs the fan from 0 RPMs all the way up to full speed, and then it sort of plots out the voltages, or of course in this case the pulses, that are necessary to achieve whatever RPM that it is supposed to be running at. So we can see the fan speed changing. So we'll plot a fan curve, basically a custom fan curve based on this fan and any other fan that you have plugged in to your motherboard. So there, it's all done. You can see it plotted that curve. So at idle, you can see here it should be running at 360 RPMs. The RPM range is 0 to 100%. And then I can manually control the fan. I can come over here and hit the smart fan. And then we can force it to go to different RPMs. So there's 50% fan speed. And you can see that's running up to, should be close to 1,000 RPMs. Yeah, that's pretty close. 75%. And when I set these, when you're in manual mode, that's the speed that the fan will stay at. It doesn't change. So around 1,500 RPMs, maybe just a tad under. And then when we go up to 100%, there's 1,800. So almost 1,900, but not quite. But ordinarily you would run it in the smart fan mode, and your fan would change speed based on the temperature. So the request from the motherboard, as your CPU gets hotter, your fan will spin faster. And you can customize this curve too. You can see I can move this around, but I'm just going to leave it where it is. Okay, we'll do some thermal testing. Now, the TDP of this cooler, the thermal design power, is 150 watts, which means this should be able to handle 150 watts of power. It should be able to dissipate that heat and keep things from throttling, keep your CPU from throttling. Now, the CPU I'm using is the 12600KF, and it is rated at 125 watts, so we're getting close to the limits of this cooler. Now, the 125 watts, that's assuming a stock setup, stock system, no overclocking, no high voltages, so you keep that wattage right at the 125 mark. But what we're going to do here, since I want to be apples to apples every time I test a cooler on this motherboard, I'm going to use the canned system settings that come with the MSI Center. So every time I test a cooler in silent mode, balanced mode, and extreme performance mode, I know I'm applying the same settings each time. So silent mode, the way you keep things silent, the way you keep your fans from running, is you don't generate very much heat. So the way you do that is you sort of dumb things down. You almost underclock it a little bit so that, again, you don't generate any heat and you don't run the fans. So that's how you keep things silent. The next mode is balanced. That's sort of a trade-off between performance and not generating too much heat, but still giving you a decent amount of performance for like a daily driver. Your extreme performance, now this is where you get a little bit of an overclock, you apply a little more voltage, and you end up generating more heat. So the payoff is more performance, you get more heat. So here we're going to put more than 125 watts into the system, and we may even do that here. I'll be able to monitor the wattage here. I'll be using hardware info to monitor that. Okay, so we're in silent mode. I'm using Prime 95 to stress the CPU to put some heat into the system, and then I'll monitor the numbers over here using the hardware info. So in silent mode, let's see, we are at, okay, our temperature, what we want to look at is a CPU package, so we're at about 74, 75 degrees Celsius. It'll probably bounce around a little bit there. Look at the wattage, we're about 100, a little over 100 watts. Looks like the max has been 104 so far. And the voltage, we're at about 1.145 currently, and if we look at our fan speed's probably going to be pretty low. Yeah, we're just a little over 1,000. And again, we're holding at 76 degrees Celsius now. And now we are ready to move over to the balanced mode. let this run for a few minutes to normalize and we'll check the numbers. Okay, so we are in balanced mode. We're holding at about 81 degrees Celsius. You can see the fan speed definitely kicked up a little there, and then the numbers here in our hardware info. Let's see, our voltage, we're at 1.110, right around there, 1.105. Our temperature here for our package, again, yeah, we're at about 81, 82. And then our wattage, we are putting the 125 watt, which is the TDP of the CPU, into the system. And now we'll go ahead and kick it up to the extreme performance level. See what that does to the fan speed. So that's going to push it up to about the limit there, just a little under 2,000 RPMs. Of course, we've pretty much hit the thermal limit. Most likely we are throttling, so here's our CPU package. Yeah, we're at 99. We actually hit 100 briefly. There we are at 100. And wattage, yeah, we're about 172. And then the voltage, we are at 1.19. Actually 1.2. So what happens when you start to throttle? You pull your CPU speeds back a little bit to keep the heat down, and of course that sort of defeats the purpose of overclocking, but you can see what that does when you dump more wattage in there than what the cooler is rated at. Now in the real world, most people don't crank the overclock up and then peg all of their cores with a full load like that. That's sort of a synthetic benchmarking sort of thing that you do to see what's the worst case and how well does the system handle it. Now, if one fan is good, two fans have got to be better, right? Because two fans. Well, that's not really how it works. I grabbed a second fan out of the liquid cooler, the Pure Loop 2 FX, and you know, since they gave me a second set of fan clips, why not? But we'll see what the performance does, and it might not do what you would think it would do. All right, so both fans are now attached to the cooler, and you can see there is some RGB stuff here on the back side of the fan. The effects come through on both sides, which is nice. Now I went ahead and started the fan tune. Since we added a fan, we need to make sure that both fans are performing in a similar manner so that our RPMs are matched. So it'll go ahead and do that. So you can see it's already going all the way down to 0 RPMs. And this one is, I think it's ramping back up. Okay, so the fan tuning is moving right along, and we'll run the same tests here in just a moment. And actually, to do this right, you need a splitter so that you can run two fans off of one header. You can pick these up, they don't cost much. But this way you can guarantee that both fans will be running at the same speed all the time. So I forgot about the splitter, so I put the splitter in there, and now I'm doing the fan tuning again. Okay, we're in silent mode. Start the stress testing with Prime 95, and then we'll come over here and see what the numbers do. Okay, so we've been running a while, and the fan speed has come down. We're holding at about 71 degrees Celsius, so we knocked about 5 degrees off with two fans, and the fans are actually running a little slower, and everything else remained the same. So let's go ahead and bump this up to balanced and let it run for a little bit and see what that does. All right, so our fan speed's around 1500. We're actually holding it 74, 75 degrees Celsius. That's a pretty good drop from the 81 that we had with one fan, and all of our other variables are staying the same, about 1.107, 125 watts. Adding a second fan does seem to make an improvement. All right, so now we go ahead and put it into the extreme performance mode, and let's see what that does. All right, so the fan speed certainly picked up again. We're right at the max. our temperature jumped up, and that may be the best we can do because we're dumping, well, we're actually putting more wattage into it this time, so we're up to 186. Voltage is at 1.24, and yeah, we are throttling. So the conclusion there is, does it give you double the cooling power? No, but it does knock a few degrees off. And it does look cool, so for a fairly minor investment in a second fan, it may not be a bad idea. And really, with 150 watt TDP on this cooler, you know, when you crank it all the way up here and go beyond 150 watts, when you're dumping, you know, 160, 180, close to 200 watts into it, you can't ask the cooler to do any more than the 150. So, as a daily driver on a system like this with a 12600 KF, this thing would be just fine. Okay, so I swapped graphics cards. This is the RTX 2070 Super that I had on there. Now I have an RTX 4090 to illustrate a point. And that point is, if you look over here, you can see the exhaust from this graphics card is being sucked right into the intake of the CPU cooler. And depending upon what you're doing with your graphics card, you know, if you're really stressing it, all that extra heat can have a negative effect on the performance of your CPU cooler. And there's not really a whole lot you can do about that other than making sure that whatever case you're using, you have really good airflow to help minimize the effects of the heat from your graphics card getting into your CPU cooler. Some of the other Be Quiet products that I've reviewed, the Pure Loop will be very similar to the Pure Loop 2. I'll actually get this one out and compare it to the Pure Loop 2 so you can see what, if anything, has changed other than the obvious RGB effects. And here are a couple of air coolers from Be Quiet that I've managed to hang on to over the years. The others have been put into systems and sold off many years ago. But these are probably my two favorite coolers from Be Quiet. And this one here I would say would take the top honor there. And they still make updated versions of these today with the hardware kits that will cover the latest sockets. These don't cover the latest LGA 1700 sockets because they're older. But what I really like about this TF2, it's a downflow cooler. That thing just looks pretty substantial, but it's a top flow cooler, meaning that the air is pulled in from the top and blows down across your motherboard. So not only are you cooling your CPU with this radiator, but you're also moving air down across your motherboard, cooling your VRM and other components that are on your motherboard. So you kind of get some extra bang for your buck. And this is the proper orientation for the Dark Rock TF, or top flow. And like I said, what I like is the way the fan pulls the air in from the top, pushes it through the fin stack. There's actually a second thinner fan and a second smaller fin stack down there at the bottom. And all that air that's being pulled in from the top ultimately is blown across your motherboard, again, to keep everything nice and cool. Okay, time to look at the Pure Loop 2 FX. My guess is, here's the original Pure Loop that I've already reviewed a while back. My guess is these are going to be pretty much identical, the only difference being we've got some RGB fans and we have the brackets for the latest CPU sockets. And the reason I say that is when I compare the back of each box, they're the same, again, with the exception of the RGB effects. Okay, so a quick comparison. This, of course, is the Pure Loop 2 FX, and we look at the this really is not the pump, it's just the base that connects to the top of your CPU, and these are essentially the same. I don't see any differences physically. The pumps are actually here within the cooling lines, which is kind of odd at first because I'm used to seeing the pumps, actually this being the pump, but the pump is actually here. So when we compare the two radiators between the two, they are the same. The pumps are the same. It looks like, as I thought, the only difference is we have the RGB effects and an updated hardware kit, so we fit the latest AMD and Intel sockets. Okay, so having compared those two, And the conclusion that I came to was that they were pretty much the same. Let's get everything out of the packaging here. Bottle of extra coolant in case you need any. So, like I said, we're going to have a hub here for the RGB effects that we didn't have with the old version. So you've got some double-sided tape so that you can stick this somewhere in your case out of the way. Yeah, we'll look at this in a little more detail a little later. Okay, now the other thing that is nice on this one, not that you ever really have to add coolant, but if you do need to, there's a port here that you can top off your coolant if you ever need to. And then of course they provide you with a fair amount of coolant here. This is main composition, water and propylene glycol, 100 milliliters, compatibility with Pure Loop and Pure Loop 2 FX. Warning, do not drink, keep away from children. Good to know. Because I was not going to drink any of it. So, back to the filling of the coolant here. If you shake this a little bit, see if I can hear it. Yeah, you can hear the coolant sloshing around. Oh, that's because there's always a little bit of air. You have to have a little bit of air. Airspace in there, because when the coolant inside here gets warm and expands, it has to have somewhere to expand into, and that's basically the air pocket that is in there. So it's normal to hear a little bit of sloshing around. Okay, the fans. Pretty sure these are the same fans that are with the air cooler, the Pure Rock 2. I'll confirm that, but I'm 99% sure these are the same. Now, the other thing I was going to point out here. So they've decoupled the pump from the base here. Again, like I said, usually the pump was inside the base and it's all one piece. But the reasoning behind that is if we keep the pump away from the motherboard, it's not mounted directly to the motherboard, we have a way to isolate any vibrations or resonating frequencies, weird sounds that can come from a pump. Now, the coolers I see around today, the pumps are really quiet. You really can't even hear them running. In the past, I've heard some pumps that you could hear. They made some noise, but it's been several years since I've heard any pumps that made any significant noise. So of course, you've got your 4-pin PWM connector that supplies power to the pump, and then we've got the RGB connector here, 3-pin RGB connector for the RGB effects. Hardware kit. So those are your screws to connect your fans to the radiator and to attach the radiator inside your case. Looks like they do a nice job of labeling. Got some thermal paste, some tie wraps for cable management, and they have these separated into an AMD kit and then an Intel kit to cover your various Intel sockets. I like AMD, pretty much one size fits all. It would be nice if Intel would do something like that, but certainly not going to hold my breath on that one. All right. So I'll be testing this on a completely different system than what I tested the original, where did it go? Yeah, the original Pure Loop cooler. So it'll be interesting to compare the results and just see how much difference there is. So I'm a little curious on the thickness of the radiator. They're usually around 15 to 16, 17 millimeters thick. And I can't get my calipers to squeeze down against the radiator because the frame here is thicker than what my calipers can accommodate. But what I can do is measure it sort of with a little help here. So I've got these aluminum spacers, so all I have to do is zero my calipers on these and then put them on either side so they extend past the frame, and then I can measure it and get a measure. Okay, so I'm coming at about coming in at 16.18, 16.19, so a little over 16 millimeters on the thickness. So once I get this installed and running, the thermal camera will show you exactly how the radiator works. So all of your coolant doesn't just go down the radiator like that. It's really split, and there's a baffle somewhere in between these two tubes. There's a baffle that separates this tank into two halves, and it's usually 50-50, sometimes it's 60-40, but somewhere in here there's a baffle, and usually you can see a little dimple. I can sort of feel it. It's right in this area here. So what happens is the coolant comes in from one side or the other. It'll be hot coolant coming from the CPU, and it will travel down one half of the radiator, gets all the way to the bottom, makes a U-turn, and then comes back up where it exits and goes back to the CPU, and it should be cooler by a few degrees. And I'll get the thermal camera out later when this is running, and you'll be able to see distinctly one side of the radiator is hotter than the other, and you can see it gets cooler as it gets to the bottom, and it continues to cool off when it gets to the other side. So on a 360 millimeter radiator, your coolant actually is traveling twice that distance. So 360 millimeters down and 360 millimeters back. Now in the manual, it talks about the fill port here. Normally you don't ever really need to open this up, but it says after 2 years to top off the coolant. And you might wonder, well, where did the coolant go? How did I lose any coolant? Did it leak out? Well, no, it did not leak out, but actually, and this may be a little hard to believe, but it evaporates. And sometimes you'll see in the literature, there'll be a reference to very low evaporation rates for their special materials that they use in the tubing. But actually the plastics that they use can actually have the coolant very slowly pass through and evaporate. But I would not lose any sleep over it since this happens very, very slowly. Okay, so I did all of the testing on the Z690 motherboard with the 12600KF. And we'll show the numbers here in a moment, along with the numbers on this motherboard. This is a Z790 with a 13900K processor. So if you're going to torture the system and see what it can do, this is the test system to do it on. And we'll take a real quick run through the numbers here. We've got the two different coolers. This is the Pure Rock 2. This is the air cooler. This is the liquid cooler here, the Pure Loop 2 FX. So what I did here is I've got the Z690 and the Z790. Same down here, Z690, Z790, with the two different processors, 12600KF and a 13900K. So your extreme here is going to be on the 13900K between the two coolers. So what you want to look at again is the final temperatures. We've got three different modes: silent, balanced, and extreme through all the testing. And we're looking at our temperatures through all three modes. And you can see here on the air cooler with one fan, we've got 76, 81, and 100. Of course, 100 is where we've got it set to the extreme mode. Not a surprise there. Same thing here when we use the 13900K. That's not really a surprise when we're dumping that amount of power into it. Now, when we went with two fans just to see what it would do, if it had an effect, it did bring the temperature down just a little. So it made an effect, but not anything that would make you believe that two fans are the absolute way to go. One fan does a pretty good job with keeping the temperatures down. Now, when we come down here to the Pure Loop 2, between the Z690 and the Z790 motherboards, again, the 12600KF and the 13900K CPUs, you can see it does a pretty good job on the Z690 of keeping the temperatures well below the threshold through all of the different testing methods. And then on the 13900, it gets a little toasty here. We're of course dumping 270 watts into it, so it's no surprise that we peg it at 100. But the thing to keep in mind here is that most people don't really run their systems at 100% on an overclock. You know, when you do, you're just dumping an enormous amount of heat, and you have so many other variables that come into effect. The the number of fans in your case, the airflow through your case, and the ambient temperature of the room. All of those things will factor into the performance of your cooler, regardless of whether it's liquid or air. Okay, we are ready for the system build, and a few things to keep in mind when you're building your system is get all your panels removed, side panels, front panels, top panels. Now this particular case, it has this that is removable, but you can't really remove the entire top section. Some cases you can, and it really makes it nice for accessing the top of the motherboard for getting cables and things like that plugged in. But get everything stripped off the case and sort of plan it out. You can save yourself a lot of time and a lot of headaches if you take your time and plan your build out before you really tear into it. One thing to keep in mind is your power supply. Now you can always remove your power supply later, but it's nice if you plan out which cables you need, get them all plugged in. If you think you might need an extra SATA cable later, just get it plugged in and then tucked away, because it's a lot easier to do it now while you're building the system than it is to try and get in there and get cables plugged in. It's a real pain. Plan out your fan strategy, which fans you're going to need, get your cables routed, solid state drives, things like that. A little bit of planning now will save you some headaches later. And we'll start off with the air cooler, but when I put the liquid cooler in, there's really only one place we can put it. That's going to be right here against this, the back of this panel right here, because there is no room in the front. Some cases have a little bit of room, but there's no room in the front to put any fans or a radiator there. So everything is going to happen right here in this area. And the top, unless you have a smaller 240 millimeter radiator, we're not going to get the 360 in there. It has to go in the front. Okay, so it is all powered up and running. I have the RGB effects turned off. You can see the power button is lighted. Now it just stays the same color all the time. And I have the glass panel off because there's so much reflection you can't see what's going on inside. So we'll just leave that off. But you can see there's plenty of room in there for the air cooler. And earlier I was talking about planning ahead. If you're using an air cooler, you need to get your connectors back here for the power to your motherboard. If the motherboard has those connectors, you need to get those plugged in before you get the cooler mounted, because it's really hard to get your hand in there, especially if you have large hands. It can be a real pain. Okay, so the other thing is this power supply here is long enough and it takes up enough room that any extra cables you need to stash, there's not a lot of room for it. So if you're going to use your hard drive cage down here for your 3.5 inch drives, it's going to be a little tight. Okay, so let's push the button here and see what sort of lighting effects. Okay, so there's the first push. Looks like it's just a solid color. You can see that. And then we'll hit it again. I don't think that did anything. Let's try one more time. There we go. So there's sort of a chasing effect there. Now the fan for the cooler here is plugged into the fan hub on the back side so that everything is synchronized. And then that fan hub plugs into the motherboard down here to one of the RGB headers. That way everything is controlled and synchronized through the fan hub or the RGB hub. So there's some nice effects. So there's solid red. Okay, that's sort of a breathing effect. So it looks like it's the same type of effects that you cycle through, just with different colors. So there's green. Keep going, we should have blue. Yeah, blue next. So there's blue. Cycle through that. Okay, this is orange. It might look a little washed out. The colors are not as good on the camera as they are in person. But that sort of matches the Be Quiet colors of orange and black, and it looks really nice. So there's the effect there, and let's see, there should be, okay, that's purple. And let's see what else. There's the rainbow. back to red. And somewhere here, okay, there's another chasing effect. It's multicolor. That's kind of nice. And then off. So if you don't want the colors or the LEDs running at all, you can just turn them off. Okay, and there's the glass panel. You can see all the reflections there. It makes it pretty much impossible to really see what's going on. So the next thing I'll do is we'll do some quick thermal testing just to see how well this case handles the heat, and then we'll switch over to the liquid cooler and give it a run. Okay, with a mild overclock and a stress test going on the CPU using the Prime 95 and then the MSI combustor to stress test the 4060 Ti GPU, we're running at about 75 C on the CPU. And the GPU, we are at around, let's see, 60 C. And those numbers seem to be holding. And it's really pretty quiet. I mean, you can tell the fans are running, but if you're more than 4 or 5 feet away, you pretty much can't hear it. Now I'll go ahead and crank the overclock up, and we'll see how much of a difference that makes. Okay, with the overclock kicked up to the extreme, you can see we're at 99, and our GPU there is still just a little over 60. And the thing to keep in mind in a situation like this, and I know it's a little hard to tell, in fact, let me take the cover off. Okay, much better without the glass and all the reflections. Okay, so what I want to point out, actually there's quite a bit of air coming in from the front. That's nice cool air. Okay. Anyway, what I want to point out is your graphics card here, depending upon which graphics card you're using and what the configurations of the fan or fans are. You got a lot of heat here that's coming out of this fan, and it's getting sucked in immediately by this fan, and of course you're trying to keep your fin stack cool so you can keep your CPU cool, so that kind of works against you there. And there's no real easy way around it with this type of graphics card and this type of cooler here in this particular setup. I suppose you could make some kind of a shroud here to cover that area and keep the heat, but yeah, that's not really going to work out too well probably. But anyway, it's just one thing you need to keep in mind. And again, you know, you're probably not going to be, stressing your CPU to the max while you're stressing your graphics card to the max. So it's probably not that big of a deal, but it is something to consider. All right, so now I'm in the process of getting the liquid cooler in there. I got the air cooler removed, and the radiator will go in the back here. And I took the fans off of the radiator. There are 3 of the 120 millimeter fans. Since they're RGB fans and they really need to be shown from the front, there's no sense adding them to the back of the radiator. So I think I'll put them in the top. There's room for 2, so we'll see if you can see the RGB effects through the top. And the radiator is installed and everything is powered up. Now I did take the 3 fans that come with the radiator and I put 2 of them in the top. Now I didn't realize, or I guess I'd forgotten, that there are some RGB effects that actually can be seen from the back side of the fans. So I could have put all 3 fans in the back here and they would have looked just fine. But as it stands, I put the 2 fans in the top, and I will end up with a 3rd fan that I don't use. And I ended up using the fan hub that comes with the radiators. That way I could get the pump here plugged in for the RGB effects. It would be synchronized with everything else, as well as the 2 fans on top. And you can see it's a little more dramatic when the lights are out, but you can see that the RGB effects do show through the top. So now I'll go ahead and get the glass side panel put on, and we'll do a real quick thermal run. Okay, we've been running for a while here, and we're holding it around anywhere between 65 and 67 degrees Celsius on the mild overclock, and the GPU is around 65, 66 degrees Celsius also. So what we'll do here is we will go ahead and crank it up to the extreme, and one of the things we'll notice is the fan speed picks up, and you can hear it a little more, especially because I have the 2 fans in the top, which I didn't have with the air cooler. So you can definitely hear those fans when they pick up speed, which is of course to be expected. Now the other thing to keep in mind is when your radiator is inside of a case, you have airflow restrictions from panels and filters, things like that. So a lot of times the numbers will run a little bit higher than they will when I have a test system out here and I'm testing out in the open and there aren't any restrictions for the fans moving air through the radiator. So you can see we're definitely moving up here. Still below 100. Our GPU is staying around 65, 66. So I'll come back and check this out in a little bit, but my guess is it'll stay right around that number. And the numbers are still about where they were earlier. We're in the low 90s there, right around 92, 93 Celsius. Now I got the glass panel off here, and you can definitely feel the heat coming into the case from the radiator. There's quite a bit of heat still coming in from the graphics card. And the fans on top, I actually have those positioned so they're pulling air in from the top and moving cool air into the case. And I can feel the cool air blowing down. I don't know if it really makes it all the way down to the graphics card or not, but they should help with getting fresh cool air into the case. So overall, I like both of these coolers. Let's look at the pricing. Right now on Amazon, the Pure Rock 2 FX is $44.90, so just under $45. And then let's take a quick look at the liquid cooler version here. So we've got the 360 millimeter version for $129. It is available in a 280 millimeter version for $109 currently. Pretty nice discount there. And then the 240 millimeter version is $99. So let's see, we're looking at the 360. So there's not a whole lot of price difference, about a $30 swing between the three different versions. You've got the typical Be Quiet quality. The RGB effects here are nice. It's you know, sometimes less is more, and I think they've done a good job. They didn't go overboard with it. So I think it's a nice addition to what we don't normally see with Be Quiet. So given all of that, especially with the pricing, I think those are decent prices. I would give both of these coolers the Overclockers Club Gold Award. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.